Welcome to the Cyber Business Podcast, where we feature top founders and entrepreneurs and share their inspiring stories. Now, let's get started with the show.
Matthew Connor here, host of the Cyber Business Podcast. Today, we're joined by Veronica Millan, the CIO of Ogilvy. Veronica, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much. I am so excited to be here today.
So excited to have you. Before we get too far in, a quick word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by cyberlinks.com. That's cyber, L-Y-N-X.com. Do you know if a hacker's in your system? Most people and most companies don't until it's too late and the hacker's already done damage. A hacker's job is to bypass your security, so companies need a way of knowing when someone's gotten past theirs. That's where Cyberlinks comes in. We've partnered with the best cybersecurity companies in the world to be able to provide our clients with the best solutions at the best prices. So whether it's managed SIEM, SOC, EDR, MDR, XDR, you name it, we'll help you find the best solution at the best price. Find out more at cyberlinks.com. That's cyber, L-Y-N-X.com. And now back to our show. Veronica, for those who aren't familiar, can you tell us about Ogilvy and your role there as CIO?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ogilvy is a historic advertising agency. It was obviously founded by David Ogilvy. And I think at least in the world of marketing, and so CMOs, our clients, people in the industry will absolutely know who Ogilvy is as an agency, not just the man. And it just has been a creative powerhouse. It wins creative awards left and right. It has just historically been an incredible agency when it comes to creativity, and a lot of that ethos comes, from the founder, from David Ogilvy himself.
Love it. So how do you, I think one of the things that I found most surprising is it's about 120 offices in 90 different countries. Is that right?
Yes, it's a large agency. We're considered a large agency. It's about 15,000 people that work inside Ogilvy. And yes, we are in every region, not every country, but in a lot of the countries around the world for sure. And yeah, it's just extensive. And our clients, extend from, consumer goods, all the way to, technology companies, professional services, it's just an extensive client base that we have across. And Ogilvy themselves, I say advertising, but I think for your audience, I should probably also explain that, advertising actually has different lines of business. So we do PR. We do, consulting. So if anyone's interested in, consulting on marketing services, that's also something else that we do aside from like the typical things that people consider advertising, like commercials, right? What we see at the Super Bowl or other things like that. So yeah, so it's extensive. It's multiple lines of business inside Ogilvy.
Love it. And being being creative at its core, is that, do you find that at all? Is that different kind of corporate wise, or at the corporate level, it's kind of exactly what you'd expect? Or is everything very creative and that adds a certain level of, I don't want to say challenge, but a different dynamic to being a CIO of such a creative company?
Yeah, I think because I've been in the industry for such a long time, I forget, right, that other companies don't work the way that advertising does. But yes, you are 100% right. It is a little bit different. I am not sure that every company has a chief creative officer, and we have a chief creative officer, right? And so there is, I think in creative agencies in particular, just a different type of culture. And I say that because in the industry, right, we have media agencies, we have PR agencies, and then we have creative agencies. And the creative agencies do have a reputation for being different, right? So the creative product, because it is sort of the product that we give to our clients, means that we have a chief creative officer. It also means that we have people that we call creatives. I have to remember that that's not a normal title in the rest of the world, right? So, you have creatives that are working in this creative department that use creative tools, right? So there's sort of this, theme around the creativity. And I think it's also what makes it fun, right? Like to be a creative, I have always said that it's a hard job, right? Because you're asking for people to be creative on demand. You're not a painter. You can decide, right? Like as a painter, do I paint one painting a year? Do I do 100 paintings a year? Like, you're sort of kind of like living sort of that life. As a creative in an advertising agency, you're working on demand, right? And your creatives can be both like art director creatives that are doing, artistic sort of design, or you can have copywriters that are actually the ones being creative around words. right? So you sort of then begin to break down what creativity is within the organization, and you have your UX designers and, your graphic designers. It just kind of permeates the studio that's making, producing the actual, stuff that the creatives have come up with. Yeah, so the company, I think by definition, then has to be different, right? Because we build, our technology and the way that we work around that creativity and what we're building for our clients.
Well, I think one of the things that I find so fascinating is that while we've had just dozens and dozens of CIOs on the show, I don't think any two have had even a remotely similar path to, into tech and at, to their path to CIO. It's all been wildly interesting. And I think that it's really fun to share that because I think that a lot of people they get to thinking that, you know what, if I'm not an Uber hacker by 16 hacking into the Pentagon, I'm never going to make it in tech. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. And yet the industry is so welcoming and there's so many ways to get in. I'd love it if you could share your kind of origin story, if you will. What got you into tech and how you got to be CIO of Ogilvy.
Yeah, it's so funny. So I always say that I have two stories that I can tell, and the audience is dependent. So if I have to promote my technology chops, and sometimes you do, right? I will say I can tell you the story of my father buying a game that I don't even know what it was called. I think it was called Turtle. And the way that you made this little triangle, because back then it was just a triangle, there were no graphics, right? Move around the screen was essentially teaching a kid how to program, right? And I didn't know that's what I was doing. My father was not into technology. He was a CFO, but like he was a finance person, right? So like he had access to computers, back in the day, but it wasn't like he was training me to be a tech person. I had no idea about technology sort of in that concept, but even just having access to video games, which I did, and then this turtle on the screen that was teaching me how to program. And then I will tell the story where, in middle school, I'm learning how to program in BASIC. And then in high school, I'm learning how to program in Hypercar. And I'm like giving away my age by giving away like the languages that I'm learning. And then in college, taking, some classes in computer science because I happened to be dating someone that was interested in computer science, right?
Nice.
Like sort of like not, I never thought of myself as a technologist, right? I think just kind of like my generation was growing up as technology was becoming more
Yep.
ubiquitous. Right. And I entered sort of, I had these moments where, technology just kind of, intersected or like being able to do an internship, at a company and they didn't care who they were hiring. They put me to do technology. I learned things, that summer that then carried me on later. But again, I never set out to be a technologist in that way. I graduated with a degree in literature. So again, not a computer science degree, not an engineering degree. Um, and I ended up by accident working with eventually a couple companies in with a company that was in publishing. And because of the material that they were publishing, I was learning about networks and servers and Active Directory and things like that. And I came to the conclusion I didn't want to be in technology. And I quit that job with the intention of moving to something else. I didn't know what the something else was, but it was going to be something else. And I quit with like no, like basically just my savings, sold everything I could, moved back in with my parents. And then I said, what do I do now? And in looking for a job, the only jobs that people wanted me for was something related to technology. And this woman who was a VP of information systems at one of the companies that I worked for, said, fine, if you don't want to come into my team as, to do something in technology, why don't you become my administrative assistant? And I said, great, no problem. And I started and I thought I was just going to be like there for a couple months, just figuring my life out. And instead, she said, let's get you working on other things. If you don't want to program, if you don't want to like get into networking or the help desk,
Nice.
completely get it. Don't do it. But let's put you like in some project management classes. And this woman, I mean, she was my mentor later on because this woman was amazing. She just knew exactly what you needed. And at the time, I said, project management sounds great. That's not technical. I can do anything with project management. And she was 100% right. She paid for me to take the project management classes. I stayed at the company, right? I got my project management experience. But I was still in technology, so I decided I needed to get my MBA. And I was convinced that after my MBA, I was not going to be in technology. It was great that I got these project management classes. It was going to help me manage, but not be in technology. And like everyone, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people that go to MBA, they come out feeling like they can run their own company. And I started my own company in absolutely the most different industry you could imagine, which was the hospitality industry. I wanted to start my own wine company.
Cool.
So I learned about wine, nothing to do with technology.
Yeah.
There's no app that was going to be built around wine. It was literally just, a 180 to where I had been working. But I realized at the time, eventually, that this was actually not what I wanted to do. And as I was looking for work, I ended up finding a job at a technology startup as a project manager, but it was a technology startup. And I think at that moment, having had that experience of starting my own company, I realized that I actually love working for corporations that are stable and, you know, have a, steady paycheck. And so working at the startup was slightly more stable than where starting my own company. And then eventually I found my way into advertising by working as a project manager, right? And there, of course, in the technology, they loved the fact that I had all this startup experience because they were starting something new. Um, and I think I just leaned in, right? Like we talk about leaning in sometimes into certain areas, and I knew that I could lean into this chaotic space that I was entering in the advertising world, and for that company that I was working at. But I think, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure. I was certain that being in technology was still my thing, but I also didn't have something else that I wanted to do so passionately. And as I started to learn advertising, I actually fell in love with the industry more than necessarily what I was doing. And I did my PhD. I wanted to study organizations because the organization I was in made no sense. Advertising made no sense at the time. And by doing my doctorate and my thesis, which was on the advertising industry, I think that's when I was finally able to sort of reconcile such an interesting, experience that I've been living with a fascinating industry and where technology fit into that, right? I think I began to understand that a lot of what I did and what I was good at was translating. I think I even translated in the past. I speak, three languages fluently, and so it was, I'd been picking up things left and right, and I did it at work. But I realized it's not just translating language, or translating culture, because sometimes people talk about translating culture. I think I was translating, what was going on the technology side with the business because I didn't want to be such a like an engineer, right? Like so focused on the technology. I was able to sort of live in both worlds. I understood what an engineer was talking about, and at the same time, I understood what the business needed, and I was able to translate between the two. And once I understood that that was sort of one of my superpowers, a lot of things fell into place, right? I was able to then progress from just being a project manager to running a region to then moving into my first advertising agency because I'd been working at a holding company before that. And then, growing within that agency, becoming, the CIO of the Americas, and then becoming the global CIO. And then now, as you find me as a CIO of an even, bigger organization like Ogilvy.
That's awesome. I mean, such a cool story, and I love that it's the almost the reluctant path to CIO, right? To the I don't think we've ever heard quite the such a reluctancy towards technology. Yeah, a lot of people would they didn't go to school for it, but
Yeah,
you were actively trying to get away. It was like the mob for you. You
I
try to
know.
get out
Yes,
and
it
they
really
keep
was.
sucking you back in, right? That's fantastic, and I really love the translation piece because it's funny. When I was in the army, I went to the Defense Language Institute and I learned Mandarin, Chinese, and Spanish. And I think that translation piece is so kind of on the nose. It's so apt for this in that you're not just translating. It's not direct translation. It's you got to understand the concepts and the idea that's trying to be portrayed, right? So it's all kind of communication. So as you're doing that
Mhm.
with project management, and you understand the project, you understand where they're supposed to go, and you're really just translating between the two. And I think that's a sign of just good leadership is you're translating the company's mission down to to your subordinates and the people and the teams, and constantly translating back from what's in the team is what the struggles that the end user or the client or the customer or whoever has their issue. You're translating that back to back to other teams. So I think that's the first I've ever heard it, and I absolutely love it. I think that's
Yeah.
such a great idea.
Yeah, I liked it too. And once I put my, head around that that's what I was doing, I think then I could understand sort of the value that I was giving to the technology department or to the technology world, right? Because one of the things that I'd seen but I didn't understand was I would see so often people that were in technology positions that they loved being an engineer, for example, and then suddenly to be rewarded, they would be made an engineering manager or a director or a VP, right?
Yeah.
And then they would, or we would talk, right? Because these would be some of my coworkers, and they would tell me how sad they are that they're not actually touching the technology anymore, right? They're just managing people and doing like the administrative stuff, and they're having to do PowerPoint presentations and all these things. And I would think to myself, I'm like, I'm okay with that. Like, I'll do that, Like, I don't want to sit in front of a screen, like just programming away or configuring away. Like, I'll do your PowerPoint presentation instead. And that also made me realize, right? Like, there are really like there are multiple paths in the technology world. But as much as you might need, the very techie people that can make the world run in that space, you also need people that can communicate, that can manage, that don't mind the administrative burden of a
Yeah.
manager. And what I try to tell women, especially women, right? Because I, as a woman in technology, right, always advocate for women in technology is I, I, I try to explain when I'm given a chance, right, that the world of technology isn't just simply being a programmer or being an engineer or being someone super technical, right? I have hired women for their communication skills, and I've always said to them, learning the technology is easy, right? Like it genuinely is. I mean, eventually, right, if you want to be a network architect, like that, obviously requires knowledge and, you probably should study and probably get certified in some things. But to learn sort of like the basic things entry level, you can, and it's much harder to learn how to communicate. It's much harder to learn how to manage people, right? Like you could go to classes and still be a bad manager. And so when I see like, hope in people, I'm like, you have a chance here, even if you don't know the technology. And that's what I like to promote, especially to women who seem to be so reluctant to come into the space because they think it's just about programming or engineering, and it's not.
Yeah, now I love that because I have a daughter who is now a rising junior at the University of Maryland studying computer science and finance. So she's doing a dual degree, and she's interning at Bloomberg this summer.
Mhm.
And that's now her second time, right? Yeah, her second internship there. But I think it's interesting the challenges that women in technology face, and I don't think that even though there are, I think, plenty of let's say guys in the space who feel that they are advocates, that they are, on the side of women. It is surprising how challenging it is, how unwelcoming, and it's just and it often you may be the only woman in the room, and let alone on the team, and it's so different, right? And it's funny that the culture, the challenges that women face in the field, and there are more coming into it, but it is I don't think there's enough kind of conversations on the guy side of those challenges to make it so aware, because it's easy to get stuck in our own little myopic world of coding, 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 or whatever it is, and not even think of the dynamics at play for for the woman sitting right beside you, who you're just oblivious to everything that's going on. So it's
Yeah.
it's it's really interesting. But now I'm really curious about your take on that. I mean, you got to I have so many questions. You get the PhD, which I think is a really interesting choice, and I'd love to hear about that. And I'd love to see talk about how that kind of played into being a woman in tech. I'd like to really kind of explore this because I think you're in a really great spot to kind of kind of shine light on some of those issues, some of those things that you've seen and experienced, as you went through. So can you kind of walk us through it, like the
Yeah, I'll
PhD and
try to address both. And interestingly, when I did my doctorate, again, because I was in technology, and when I applied, you generally apply and you already telling the university what it is that you want to study. So I went in there and I was like, I don't know about this advertising industry. I just want to understand how it works. Um, and you can always change your topic, right? So you apply, you go in with one topic, and then as you go through the experience, right, you learn, you read, you write, and you can change. Obviously, you can decide that, the data sets that you have are different because you found something else. And so in my case, I had actually a tremendous amount of data from where I was working, but it was sort of a more, let's say, a technical data set. And I could have done my doctorate on that, and it would have probably been a more technical doctorate in that way. But like my career, I was very much like, I could because I have this rich data set, but I don't want to. I was like, I actually want to go back to my original question, which is understanding the industry. And I will say this, which I think a lot of technology people sometimes, and I say that on purpose, technology people don't necessarily understand. And I do think it makes the difference, because I've seen it in my career, which is I think it is invaluable for anyone in technology to understand the industry that they're in. And too often, I think technology people, when you ask them what industry they're in, they say technology. And that's not where they're, unless they work, right, for a literal technology company, right? They work in manufacturing, they work in pharmaceuticals, they work in advertising, right?
yep.
They work in banking. Like they should understand the industry that the company that they're in. And inadvertently, right? Because I did not, I be the first one to say I did not do this on purpose, but by studying the advertising industry, I gave myself an advantage that a lot of my colleagues around me didn't have, right? They might have known about the industry because they were in it, or they might have been really good technologists. And again, they said they didn't, their answer in what industry are you in? They said technology, even though we were in advertising. They didn't necessarily understand the advertising business, but by understanding sort of the history of advertising, how the advertising business had evolved, the challenges that we were facing today, that allowed me to then be able to translate even better, right? So that was sort of like the invaluable thing that I learned from my doctorate was if I understand this business like a CEO understands it, because I've now studied it thoroughly, hopefully the CEOs understand it that deeply, then I can actually align my technology strategy to the business and have it truly be aligned to the business. It's not the CEO telling me what I should be doing or the CFO telling me what I should be doing, right? This is me being proactive and saying, I understand the challenges we're facing and this is how we can approach it through technology.
I love that. I,
Yeah.
I think that's really brilliant because interestingly, most people would take that MBA and be like, "Yep, now I'm good. I've got everything I need to be a CIO." Work at the executive level in pretty much any company in any industry, and I think it's so astute to point, to have identified that, yeah, most people in tech, that's the way they think about it, and those CIOs, and even often a lot of CEOs, they don't think of it, they rather than being an expert in that industry, a lot of them are treated as though, oh, look, you were great over here in this industry, you'll be great over here. And
Mhm.
and I think I really love your way of going about being really educated in that particular industry. And so I follow-up question on there
Yeah.
on that whole line of thinking was how did you communicate that? I mean, when it comes to like getting your job, your next job at, as you were progressing after your doctorate, did you just was it kind of a natural, competitive advantage? Spain, like, no, I am so good. I've doctorate in advertising. Yeah, who are you going to choose, right? When it's an apples to apples comparison, like, do you want the CIO who doesn't know jack about the industry, or or somebody who's an expert in it? All other things being equal, you win, right? Was that kind of the thinking?
No, I wasn't exactly thinking that that's how it was going to turn out. Um, because in my industry, I do have to say that having those titles don't necessarily give you progression. So my spouse
Mm,
works for a company where everyone has like two doctorates. It's incredible, right? So your
wow.
titles matter. Um, but I think what I was able to do, and this is something again inadvertent, but it happened, which is when I understand the industry very well, the conversations I'm having are no longer right with my colleagues about technology and how do we implement and deploy something, right? My conversations were now with the CFOs, right? The market CFOs, the regional CFOs, the global CFO, or the CEOs, right? Or the COOs, if there were some, or the head of HR, right? The chief people officer. And so I was now having conversations across the different departments, even though I wasn't technically a CIO at the time, right? And I think that's when I became, the global CIO prior to Ogilvy. I think that's, why it was a natural, like my manager at the time decided to take another role. And he came to me and said, by the way, we'd like you to accept the global CIO role. And I was like, yes, absolutely, no problem. But I think he thought of me because he knew that my relationships with the business were not just with my immediate colleagues in technology, right? They were across the entire organization, right? So people already saw me as a trusted advisor, and he understood, right, that being a CIO requires you to be a trusted advisor, not just simply someone that knows the most tech in that space. And so I think he was like, of course, compared to maybe some of my other colleagues, right? Like she actually is able to have a business conversation and then, bring that back to her team and translate it in a different way for the technical people. And to tell you the truth, I think as I decided to move into Ogilvy, right, the conversations that I had, in that process of interviewing, I don't think anyone asked me, like, do I have a certification in Amazon for whatever, or do I know how to use PowerPoint, right? Like, there were no conversations about technology. It was more about strategy, right? This is a challenge, Ogilvy, the agency has. How would you approach it? Or they would say, well, we were trying to get to this point. How would you do it? Right. And my answer isn't, I mean, in fact, I'll be like a lot of CIOs. I think we have to say no, right, to technology, right? We can't just say we're going to deploy everything and anything you want. And I think a lot of what I come to the table with is to say, hold on a minute, right? Technology is not going to solve your problem, right? You have a process problem, you have an operational problem, you
Yes.
have, something else problem, you have a people problem. You don't have a solution, right? Because I think so many CIOs get burned, in fact, all technology teams probably get burned when you think or when the business thinks all you need is just to implement the next latest greatest whatever, and then that doesn't solve the problem, right? So what do you do then? And again, so it was again, the interviews were not about what technologies I've deployed before. It was more about how do I see the strategy moving forward for Ogilvy? And I think that's sort of, you can't have that conversation if you don't understand the business or the industry, right? In this case, because I didn't know Ogilvy, but I knew the advertising business and I understand the challenges that we're in. And so again, I think CIOs need to be able to sort of have those conversations because that at the end of the day is what they're doing, right? Probably doing a lot of translating between their tech teams and the business.
Absolutely. Now, do you think that it was the getting your doctorate in and kind of specializing, if you will, in advertising, was that really was that really necessary after your MBA, or was it just that you really wanted to understand the industry, and by having that really helped kind of propel that further? It wasn't so much the credentials necessarily of having the doctor, or I'm curious if it
Yeah,
is that,
no.
was it just that you now gained this knowledge, you had this, that,
It's the knowledge. Yeah, don't I for anyone listening to this, you do not need a doctorate to be able to get ahead, in your industry. I think it's the knowledge. It's taking the time to understand, right? Because again, what I was learning in the program was, philosophy classes, methodology, things that are not related to advertising. But when you do the research, right, to write your thesis, that research is a research that I was doing in the industry and understanding, right, like where the industry sat in a historical and a modern day, place and its competitors, right? Because I did a competitor analysis in my dissertation. And I think that's what I think a lot of people seem to forget, right? Is that they need to understand their business, not just because they're in it and they know how their company makes money, but then looking at, historically, where does your company come from and how did it get there and what did it do right or wrong? Right. And then what are your competitors doing? Right. So that competitor analysis to, keep track of what everyone else is doing in the industry so that you understand, right, where you are in that industry. But again, you don't need a doctorate for doing it. The doctorate for me at the end of the day, I mean, I get to call myself doctor sometimes. That's great. Um, it did give me the discipline and it gave me an outlet for writing because I think you also have to become a good writer if you do a qualitative thesis, right? Not a quantitative one. And I like writing, and I think the doctorate also helps you have opinions, which again, I know a lot of executives might be very good at what they do, but they don't necessarily take like a strong opinion on anything. I do think that it
Yeah.
allowed me to have opinions. And so I think that also gave me access to writing in our industry press because I had opinions about different things. Because again, I was comfortable, putting, my name and my word against something and saying, okay, this is what's going on. So a few years ago, as we were entering, the world of the metaverse and all of this, blockchain, this was before AI.
Yep.
I happened to have a conversation with someone in the press that liked that I was taking a more sort of educational approach and like distilling down what was going on with sort of this especially in our industry, in my industry where no one knew what the metaverse was, or if you talked about cryptocurrency or blockchain, explaining what Bitcoin was, what any of these things. Today, more people know that, but this would have been 3, 4 years ago. No one knew what this meant, and it was beginning to become something. Everyone's like, "Well, the metaverse is going to solve all our problems." Like, what is it? And I was like, "Okay, hold on. Let's distill what we're talking about when it comes to the metaverse, right?" And it was fun, right, to do again the research because I love doing research and being able to say, look, the metaverse is just an extension of the gaming universe, right? And the gaming universe has been in existence for, 20, 30 years, right? Like it's not like something just popped out of the air. But again, the metaverse at the time was just sort of like it was entering its hype cycle. And so, of course, everyone's like, oh, we have to do something with the metaverse. I don't know what the metaverse is. How do we get into the metaverse? And so I took that opportunity to sort of do these articles, which just kind of distilled emerging technologies down to sort of like let's hold hands and understand that this is just an evolution of what's already existed.
Yeah. I like that. And I think so it's really one of the key skills, I guess, or a couple of the key skills that you refined when while obtaining your doctorate was really kind of the researching, how,
Mm,
kind of getting an opinion, researching and backing that opinion, and being able to write well enough, that you could clearly communicate that in a way that is convincing, right?
yeah.
So you apply those skills now on a kind of a micro, level every day when it comes to things, and now you're a much stronger leader versus I think at least me, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think generally when I think of people, when they've gotten their doctorate is they want to do something in academia. They really love that subject. They want to study it. They want to teach it. And so they tend to go and be, professors and kind of researchers, but you don't off I haven't historically thought of them as, what, those are all fantastic skills that help you to be a better leader, to be able to research it, have an opinion, communicate it very clearly, and people be able to get on board with it because it's like all of this makes perfect sense. All right.
Mm,
So many people, especially today, are very opinionated and they don't seem to have anything behind what they're saying. And then it's just like people yelling at each other. Okay, can we just go rewind and go back to the days where we actually like did some research, had some reasons behind our opinions instead of just demonizing each other. And this is happening, I think, on a lot of different levels in our society, these days. And
mhm,
so I think I'm really fascinated by the fact that that's how it's played out for you. And
mhm,
I may just, kind of live in my own little bubble and haven't really had a conversation where somebody really articulated that in a way that it makes perfect sense. More people probably should get their doctorate, if for no other reason than because so many people don't learn how to write well, right? Even
Oh
when they go
yeah.
to college, they like, oh, I took my intro to writing course and ugh, it was horrible, and then they don't apply it, and then they're like, ugh, they can't even write a coherent email, let alone a convincing argument or a presentation or anything else.
And I will say, so in my industry, right, we are storytellers, right? Like advertising is basically convincing you to buy something, right? So we tend to be good storytellers. But even in this industry, in technology, because I fomented in my previous teams, right? Their skill set in especially my leadership, my direct reports, in how to be good storytellers, right? So like I would bring companies in that would talk to them about like, okay, so let's talk about like how do we do a presentation that people actually care about, right? Because again, my leadership was also talking to the business, right? So I needed them to be able to have that conversation and not be super techy. And I think we've lost a little bit, in the technology world because we focus so much on skill set and like what your chops are in that space and not necessarily in your ability to tell a story. And your ability to tell a story is, for example, what helps you in change management, right? You want to deploy a system, you need to be able to convince people to join you in that,
Yeah.
system, right? Convince them to join you in the training, make the training be relevant, right? All of these things. And you do that through storytelling at the end of the day, right? Or creating an argument, whichever one, however you want to do it. Like in my
Yep.
industry, we say storytelling. When I was in school, it's creating an argument, convincing you, right, that
Yep.
doing this is the right thing to do. But yes, I agree. And I think in technology, we don't do enough storytelling. We don't explain enough why we need to, you know, have every machine be managed, to speak about security and other things. Like, why do we want every server, right, to have these agents on, right? Like, we just kind of I've seen it, right, with our security teams. They're just like, oh, we just need agents everywhere, right? But explain to, the employee why we're implementing this. Like they're going to be afraid, right, that they're going to be watched or that, their machine's going to run slower, any myriad of things that, our employees have an issue with, like when technology gets deployed without explanation. But, explain to them that they're going to be safer. This is a story, or, we've had, three hackers in the company's, server so far. This is why we're locking things down. Like, people will understand those things, but it's again, we I think in technology we need more of the art of the story that we don't have.
Yeah. Totally agree. Um, well, I can't help but wonder if this your storytelling abilities, don't massively help in obviously your current role, but I'm curious about its its role in your path to success, to where you are. Was storytelling, as you kind of started to focus on that and build those skills, throughout your process, was that something that you really kind of amplified and accelerated your rise to the top, if you will? Did it make things a lot easier, or was it I because I can imagine going back to the women in tech. There are so many hurdles and obstacles that most guys are completely oblivious to. And I think I'm really curious if the storytelling was part of that, your path that made it easier because people could relate to what you were saying, and it just made more sense because you're a good
Yeah.
storyteller.
Yeah. I mean, so I think the answer immediately, like too long didn't read, yes, absolutely. I think people, and it doesn't matter, right, men or women, if you tell a good story, I think people will listen. And if they listen, right, then they might actually pay attention. And if there's a call to action in your story, they might actually then take the call to action, right?
Yeah.
But if you can't even grab them, right, it's like a song, right? You need the hook, right? You need, or, a TV show, the first
Yep.
line of a book, right? Like if you can't hook people, you've already lost them, right? So that it doesn't matter that you've done that you're the best, data analyst out there, right? You're the chief data officer. Like it does not matter.
Yep.
No one will listen if you haven't, captured them, right? Because and especially if you're speaking to executives because they have like a million things going on and their phone is probably going off with emails and, they're gonna go to whatever's calling them first, right? But if they're gripped by the beginning of your story, then they might actually ignore their phone for a minute and pay attention to what you're trying to say. So I do think there is that, but I think what I've always believed, and I can't tell you like when this belief started, but maybe it's been forever. I've always believed that everything has a reason, right? An explanation, right? And in looking for that logical explanation for something happening, and that's what drove me to get the doctorate, is what allowed me to then say, oh, okay, there's an explanation for this. And if I understand this, I might have another question and then I want to understand that, right? And that both led me to research the industry, right? I'll do that infamous doctorate. But at the same time, like I think understanding like the whys also help you in the story, right? So like when I do a presentation, I think about my audience first and I try to understand like why would this person care to be in the room as I'm giving this presentation, right?
Yeah.
And again, if it's a status update, it could be an email. It doesn't have to be a deck,
Yep.
right? Like again, what's the call to action? What's the story that I want to tell, right? My team needs funding. Okay, but that might be a story I want to tell. So how do I tell that story in an interesting way that actually gets, the call to action, which is give me the money, right? But it's also trying to follow the logical way. Like I can't speak for so many instances, right, where there's never enough money for technology because maybe the organization at that moment in time sees technology as just the plumbing, the back office, right? Nothing valuable. It's not innovation. It's not going to change the world. And so then the story that you have to tell is really not about getting funding, but rather about how technology is business critical to the organization, right? So it's sort of like trying to find out ways of what's the story you want to tell and then being able to understand your audience so that you're not talking about your Active Directory and whether you're picking Palo Alto versus Cisco. I mean, like no one cares,
Yeah.
right? Not at that level, right? But they might care, right? If you tell them that they're not investing enough in technology, that they're going to be left behind by their competitors,
Yeah.
right? And then that's the story you end up telling.
So I would imagine that in the advertising industry that there's a lot of really good storytellers. So at that level, it's kind of the typical kind of death by PowerPoint does not cut it, not even for a second. So I think you guys are playing like top tier ball when it comes to storytelling, right? This is A game level. So even on the tech side, the CIO, you've got to be really good. You got to keep up with everybody else's good storytelling because you're in an industry where it's all focused on the creative storytelling. Um, I- so do you have any tips or tricks that you could share with all the geeks listening who are not in the creative industry that they might be able to use in theirs?
Yeah, yes. So I do actually, because I do this myself. So first of all, more pictures than words. It has to be aesthetically interesting. And that's probably the hardest one, but maybe with like the tools that are out there today, AI, right? That
Right?
maybe that's a little easier nowadays. Um, and I think that, if you start thinking about like putting in a network diagram, you know, you need to take a step back, right?
Not
It
those
it
pictures.
not those pictures, no network diagrams. Yeah, no, if you're cutting and pasting from Visio, right? Like probably not. Because I think, it goes back to understanding who your audience is, right? What do they care about, right? Because having a presentation to the company, right, you might have to do that, is very different than if you're just presenting to the CFO or to the CEO. You have to understand, right, like again, the business, and the business generally is not interested in the network diagram of your organization, or how many, like anyway,
Yeah.
they aren't necessarily right. And so then it becomes a question of, visually what you're presenting, at least in my industry it is, and then about, addressing, right, the business capabilities. So aesthetically, along with content. And a lot of what we do, for better, for worse, right, is you speak it, you don't put it on the slide, right?
Yeah.
So 3 or 4 bullet points max, right? If your font is like down to 12 point, you probably need to rethink what you've put on the slide.
Uh-huh.
Images matter, right? And sometimes the image, does not have to be, again, the network diagram, right? But it can convey, the message that you're trying to get across, right? So it becomes a thing about feelings more than anything else. Um, and again, you have to be really clear on the story that you're telling, right? And what is ultimately, right? What is the call to action that you want at the end of it? Um, it is, it's not easy. And I don't think my decks at all compete with what some of my, you know, coworkers can do because they're the chief creative officer. Like there's no way my deck is going to compete with that. Or like our chief growth officer, again, no way it's going to compete with that. And in fact, there are some people on my team that are really good at what this week I saw a presentation I was like, okay, I have to remember this guy is really good at doing decks. Um, yeah, again, we're talking about creative tools, and he was just really good at how he presented his creative decks. And less is more, right? That was the thing about his deck was it was less is more. And I think a lot of people forget that, right? They want to put everything on the slide because they want to get credit for everything they've put on the slide. The only caveat to that is I will say board of director decks, very different. That absolutely requires a pre-read, put everything on the board of directors
Right.
deck. That is the one thing I have learned. So there are, your audience matters. Board of directors, you put
Right.
everything in the deck. Not board of directors, you can not put as much on the deck. Yeah.
Yeah, no, know your audience. I mean, that goes right back to communication 101, right? That is kind of paramount. And you've mentioned that a number of times in various different ways. And I think it's so important and people do lose sight of that. Um, and one thing I really have to ask you about though is AI in advertising. Like, so
Yeah.
where do you see this kind of playing out? Normally we'd stick to AI kind of tools and see it, but I think that you're in that space where this is such an interesting time for the advertising industry. So, you know, where do you see AI in terms of advertising? Is it this a great tool that helps kind of, accelerate things? Is this an existential crisis? What is it? And how are you going about it?
Yeah. So a lot of people in my industry will say that AI is disrupting the industry. Um, and the industry is being disrupted. I don't know if it's AI that's doing it though. And part of the reason why I don't think it's AI that's doing it is because I actually think one, AI is doing incredible things to the creative product that we're making, right? And it's really interesting because AI like has had different names, I think, right? Like it's, we use AI today like to basically, include everything from machine learning to RPA to like everything else, right? Like, and that's not really AI. But I can argue that some of the creative tools that we have in our industry, right, have had AI because they've been sort of building these automations and these predictive abilities to help us do the creative work. And today, of course, sold as AI for years, right? And the it's not even about doing things faster. Sometimes, right, we have to have conversations with our clients that it's not about efficiencies. It's just that we're doing something better, right? We
Mhm.
can mock up an idea and we still have to film it, right? Maybe we still have to go to Croatia and film it in the mountains and, all the things. But we can now get to the client an idea of what we're doing before we spend a flight to go to Croatia to like, figure out if this is even going to work, right? We
Right.
can mock up that concept and actually have something that feels reasonable to what the end product is going to look like. And yes, that is faster. And so, yes, technically, maybe there's an efficiency, but it's also much better. I mean, if you watched Mad Men from like 15, 20 years ago, whenever it was on the screen, they were doing things on paper, right? On cardboard, and they were putting it on these easels. Like you have to imagine what a commercial looks like, mocked up on an easel, right? Like today, we can actually give you a mock-up of that film, of that what that 30-second commercial might look like. And you can then say yes or no to it. And then when you say yes to it, right, we can then go to Croatia and film it or wherever we're going to film, the commercial. And there's so much value to being able to do that because now we can actually give the client exactly what they want. And the client can actually see it because not everyone, right, can imagine, these pieces of paper telling a storyboard, right? Like what we call a storyboard telling the story as what it actually might look like in the end, right? And we can say, yeah, this, we can actually have this actor or this actress, or this is what the family in the commercial is going to look like. without just simply describing, kind of mocking it up and not then having to find, the people. Anyway, it just makes things, I think, better, right? The tools are better and the ideas are better. And then I think where it's been interesting, especially now that we've entered, the era of agentic AI, is trying to work out what does agentic AI mean in our space. And so I think generically for most corporations, right, agentic AI is going to make things faster. Maybe it'll help me make my expense report, faster. It might process, questions around HR that we might have, questions around S&Ps, like all of that we didn't have before or that would have taken a few minutes or a few hours to do. Absolutely. If it's happening in banking and manufacturing, it's absolutely going to happen in advertising. And I think what I hope, right, is that we'll find ways to then actually spend time on what's really important, which is either if for us, it'll be like the strategy for clients, developing what's next for them, et cetera, because advertising has generally sort of been at the front end of whatever's coming next. So we'll spend more time doing valuable work, right? That, interesting work rather than doing, the other. And then in terms of what's also possible, right, is that the world is also changing, right? So whereas in the past we might have had again Mad Men, right? We're talking about television commercials, the world is also changing, right? And so today, as you may have heard, and maybe not, depending if you're in the industry, you absolutely know, is that these LLMs, right? People are going to the LLM first before their Google search, right? So how do you make products findable, right? If that's a word,
Yep.
discoverable, I think is the right word,
Yep.
in an LLM when you can't, right? So advertising is changing, right? Like I want people to find, my brand of beer, and I have to make sure the LLMs know that that brand of beer exists. And if someone's asking for something that's cool, refreshing, light, whatever they're looking for, that they'll be able to get the beer recommendation, right? That my clients might be interested in. And I think people aren't necessarily looking at that. So do I think AI will be the end of the world? I mean, I know there's a lot of people that are concerned. I tend to be an optimist. I'm hoping that human ingenuity will be able to not let that happen. I'm probably too optimistic, but at the same time, maybe because I am a technologist, I understand what this is. And, it's still a tool, right? We still have control over it. We can turn it off. And to sort of turn this back into like sort of women in technology, because I do want to talk about that a little bit. I think too, right? We also have the ability to train it. And so where some people are really concerned about what AI can do, right? Our onus is also to sort of teach it to be better. Yesterday, I heard someone say that it's almost like we're being parents to this AI after someone had described it as it's like an unlimited number of interns with no rules doing whatever they want, right? That's what agentic AI is. That's how they described it. And I love that description because if you imagine just like
Yeah.
hundreds of interns running around with no supervision trying to do something, right? That's what agentic AI is today. It will get better,
Yeah.
right? But then that also then, the person that mentioned, parenting, I mean, but that's what it is, right? Like you have to teach these agents to be better, these LLMs to be better. And I think we have an opportunity to do that, right? It is not only, like these LLMs cannot only be trained on just what's on the internet, right? Like we as individuals using AI are actually training it. And hopefully we're training it better. So again, the discussion was like, do we say thank you to ChatGPT when it's giving you an answer?
Right.
And the consensus was you absolutely should, because then ChatGPT is learning manners,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
It will say thank you back to you eventually, right? So
Yep.
like that's the idea is like we have to teach it to be good to humans,
That's right.
nice to
No,
humans.
totally agree. Absolutely. I don't care that it's melting the internet and costing us billions of dollars to say thank you. Manners
Exactly.
are
But
important.
manners are important. Yes, etiquette. It's what matters to humans.
That's exactly right. So, all right, let's talk women in tech.
Yeah.
This is a really big I think it's a really big conversation. It's a really big idea. You obviously have a much, different perspective and vantage point than I do, on the entire thing. And so, I would love to hear, what you want, what aspect would you like to start off with here?
Yeah, I'm gonna rattle off a bunch of things and then you can tell me if you want to dig deep on any one of these. So in my experience, again, in my background, um, women need men to support them. And I have had men support me, like, for example, when I became CIO for the first time, right? My former manager, gave me that opportunity. 100% thankful that, he felt that my gender didn't matter in that decision making. But I also equally have had conversations with men who have come up to me and said, you should start a women in IT organization in the company. And I'm like, why me? Like, if you want to support women, because we're having a conversation about supporting women in IT, I'm like, you start it.
You
You're
start.
the guy, right? Like you can actually do more in this space than I can,
Yeah.
right? Because you can actually promote women, right, in your team and, bring them up to sort of those leadership levels than I can because I'm in a different team, right? So like, this is like don't give women the onus, right, of doing this work.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I think to talk about like women in IT. It is not only about women promoting women and putting them right on the track to be leaders in technology. It's also for men to not just not be biased, but to actively say we're going to promote women because we want, the shape of the organization to look differently. And, again, a former manager, that I had, it made me think because I should have known, but it's, he was hard to understand sometimes. And so he said something to me once when I was trying to hire a bunch of women in the organization. And a lot of the open positions that I had were at the help desk level, right? So, entry level, maybe, 2 or 3 years after university. And he said to me, he goes, I understand what you're doing. Good for you for bringing in and making your teams hire women at that level. He goes, but you have now created sort of a strange organization where you're at the top, which is great. You're a woman. Everyone in your management, including the middle, are males. And then you have a bunch of women at the bottom. He's like, when you start doing the math, it's going to look like there's this salary discrepancy between women and IT because you only have women, right, at that entry
Right.
level. If you really want to make a difference, you have to sort of shape the organization. And I was like, oh my God, he's 100% right. Like, how do I change the shape of this organization? And so, those are the other things to think about, right? Which is sometimes, right, you can't just think that you're going to fill the bottom and then they're slowly going to grow, right? Because again, no guarantees of how that growth happens, but that the entire shape of the organization has to include women at different levels. And so, what I've tried to do throughout my time is to try to understand, okay, so why is it that in this team, and I've had teams be led by women, there are so many women, like 50-50, right? Like there's no I have nothing to say to that person to say like, you need to change, your org. And then I'll go to another team where it's like primarily men and I have to, talk to that director and say, how is it that, you haven't been able to hire a single woman into your org? Right. And to try to understand, okay, so what's going on here? And so once I did this to my direct reports again, we did a lovely inclusion conversation. We took like the Harvard, bias test,
Yeah.
everyone understood their biases. And we had a conversation about it, right? And in advertising, not to continue the stereotype, but there is a little bit of a stereotype where you can, go after work and have drinks and, probably other industries do it too. But, it's that idea of like you work hard and you party hard. And I said to my team, are you considering other, team building events for your teams? Because there are women, right, that probably have caretaking duties at home that can't stay for the happy hour, right? And actually, there's probably men too, right? Like fathers that would love to be home with their children and tuck them into bed, right? But they won't say anything, right? But the mother might actually say something and be like, no, I got to go home because my husband has his own happy hour, at work or whatever. And I said, we have to think about like these team building events can't just simply be a happy hour at the end of the week, right? It has to be, I don't know, a lunch, a breakfast,
Yep.
let's do something else, right? Like there's other things to do and also being inclusive, not just in that sense, but like there are just people that don't drink, right? So like you also don't want to sort of narrow down the people that are going to go out with you because they're not drinkers and they don't want to be challenged on why they're not drinking or whatever the case may be, right? Like we can do something else than drink, in other words,
Yep.
because it's important, right? Or all of these things. And I hope they're left with that legacy of having to think twice. But I think that's the mentality that we have to have around as we think about women coming into the org. It's not just bringing them in or hiring them, but it's also how do we make it more inclusive? And I think this is the hardest part because I have been in spaces where I am the only woman and I can tell that the men around me are uncomfortable that I'm in the room.
Hmm.
And I don't know how to fix that, right? Because I can't pretend to be a man and I can't fix why they're uncomfortable, right? And they're sometimes uncomfortable because they're like, they don't want to swear in front of me. And I'm like, no, I swear like a sailor, swear in front of me, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's okay. Or maybe there's another reason. Maybe they don't want to drink as much in front of me because I remind them of their mother. I don't know, right? But just drink in front of me. I'll drink too. Like it's no big deal.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like how, I don't know yet how you break that other than just spending time with each other and getting to know each other,
Yeah.
right? And continuously, be invited to those events, right? So be inclusive, consider other things, and then even, right, make sure you're developing those relationships.
Yeah.
Um, Yes, and I think also reminding women that being in technology, it's not just about being in technology, which I think is, the key, which is yes, you have to know something about technology, but you don't have to be an engineer. You don't have to be certified in anything, right? That there are jobs, and especially in project management, where I think, women can go into without that idea that I have to be good at math or I have to know how to program something or any of these things.
Yeah, I mean, especially as you progress beyond the entry level, those
Yeah.
communication skills, which women are naturally more proficient at, I think lends to them excelling in technology and all leadership skill positions. The interesting part is how culturally that has not been the case. It's not been received and promoted that way, but on the surface and for all intent, for all intents and purposes, it should be. Like if gender or sex was taken out of the equation altogether, I don't know what the cultural issues are that and obviously it's complex, and I think it just takes a lot of these conversations, but with guys, having those conversations like, yeah, why don't I start I think going back to the first part where you said that why doesn't a guy start the program to for women? 100%. I think the initial thinking for all the guys who see themselves as advocates is that yes, I'm there for you, but I don't know if it's a lack of knowing what to do because it's new, right? It's new ground, new territory. Um, and they're just not comfortable, but they don't want to also kind of railroad. So I think ultimately it comes down to having to have more of these conversations where you have the conversation of, hey, we should start this, women in tech, um, movement or whatever club, whatever we're going to call it in the organization. And then you come back with, yeah, I think that's great, but you should start it, to the guy. Like, why not? Because you do need those. Everybody needs a cheerleader, right? Everybody needs somebody, advocating for them and helping to pull them up. I don't, guy or girl. It does. Nobody succeeds, on an island. Nobody is an island. They don't succeed alone.
Mm.
They need help from others. And I think the thing to get across to guys is that they need to be helping the women having these conversations, and we need to normalize that because I think too many guys think, oh, I'm an advocate, I'm all for it, you should go do that. Well, you're just giving them more work, you're just
Yes,
making it harder.
exactly.
Like,
100%. Like,
you're
why do
not
I have to
advocating.
do extra work? I'm already doing extra work.
Yeah, I'm having to work extra hard because I can't make a mistake and somebody say, "Oh, it's okay." So
Yeah.
there's already, and for a lot of women, they have to be doing an even better job than their male counterpart. And that's just the reality as it stands, I think, right now, which is probably the sad truth until things get better. And so on top of that, they're also going to have to start everything. Come on, right?
I know, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the other thing, and because I think it's important too to have this conversation, because I think I've been skirting around it. But I remember in my career, right, too many times having men come to me and tell me that they're better at X. They're better programmers, they're better network engineers, etc. And every time they've said that to me, thankfully, right? And it's always come because I was either promoted or given a project that they wanted. I always was like, but that's why you didn't get it,
That's
right?
right.
Like that's
That's
literally why
right.
you didn't get it.
Literally.
But it's coming from an angle, I think, right, historically, that the more technical you are, right, then that is why you get promoted or why you get the better projects or why you get anything, right? And I think we need to talk about how in the technology space, it's not just about all the certifications you get or how technical you are, right? That will get you the technical projects, right? That will get you working in that space. But yeah, I mean, management is management, right? Or if you're a project manager and you're leading it, right? Like, why would you give that to an engineer instead, right? So like it like we need to have a better conversation about how you succeed in an organization. And I think too often we end up again giving management administration roles to people that really should be technical. And I love when companies have that technical path instead of just being limited to, well, you're an engineer, the next step is manager. You know, like,
Yeah.
no, that poor engineer needs to like become a senior engineer, right? They don't need to become a manager because you're about to like make their world terrible, but also so that they can not have to compare themselves as maybe a woman that is becoming a manager. Because
Yep.
again, they might be at the same level, but just simply responsible for different things. And to promote, right, that communication skills or management skills are equally needed as much as the technical skills in these teams.
Yeah, I mean, you hear it all the time. It's promoted to the point of incompetence. Yeah, you were such a great engineer. That's where you should stop. You're not, once you get management, you might not be. Some engineers are great managers, right? And they want to do that. But that is, you take the extreme of that, imagine, and it's so obvious. You take that guy, and I'm gonna say it because that's who it is. It's some guy who lives in the dark and they drink lots of Mountain Dew and they eat Oreos and Doritos and they code like a genius. And they got their headphones on and they have no people skills, but they're absolutely fantastic. And it's a stereotype, but we all know one, at least one. We've all met one. You want them to be the CIO? Well, they're the best programmer in the organization. Even if you're a software company,
Yeah.
no way, right? No way do you want them to be in charge of anybody. In fact, nobody even wants to talk to them and they don't want to talk to anybody.
Yeah.
So they're the best. Why aren't they in charge? Because
Mhm.
those aren't the skills you need to be in charge, right? It's not. And so I love that. I mean, it's interesting because in the army we had, you've got the enlisted and you've got the officers, right?
Right.
And it's great. And they had that track. The warrant officers are those technical experts who are in between the two. You raise and you get to focus on that technical aspect, right? You get to focus on the job, not being an officer, not getting promoted to being an officer. And now it's a management role. It's totally different. Now you're no longer the technicians who's great at whatever that
Yeah.
field was. And I think you're right. People just have to get that out of their head. And we've seen the devastating effects of promoting people, and then they're just great. You were great at your job, but now you've been rewarded by now being in a place where you're incompetent, and
Yeah.
then nobody's happy.
Yeah.
And then right, so no, totally agree with that. And I think that's how do we? Does that just take time? I mean, to get it, it's so offensive to hear it, right? Like I'm a better
Engineer and therefore
engineers, like
yeah.
go fuck yourself. What are you talking about? Like that's not what the job was about, dude. Right? Get it, got it, cool.
Yes.
But yeah, it's that mindset. But let me ask you, have you had a lot of issues with guys who simply, you know, have a hard time getting behind a woman being their boss? Is that like, is that a thing, or have you seen, is it
Mm.
starting to change more, or you can just, you know,
So in my experience, I haven't, right? Not in the sense of like I wouldn't report to a woman and you're a woman, therefore I have an issue with you, at least not to my face.
Mhm.
Um, so maybe the world is different. I also want to believe that I'm a good leader, right? And that I'm a good manager and that I have my team's back. And I think eventually, even if they have their doubts, right, especially when you're going into a new team or any of these things, like once they see that, they begin to trust you. So thankfully, right, like I've had generally positive experiences when it comes to that, but I also think it's because I am a good leader and I've shown that I can be a good leader and a good manager. And, oftentimes, especially the more technical ones are actually kind of relieved that they're no longer like they're not thinking in their head, oh my God, if I get this job, I can't be technical anymore, or whatever the case may be, right? Like I do sometimes think there's a little bit of that, especially if I have the conversations with them about, okay, so, what is it that you really want to do with your career? Right? Because the technical ones will say they just want to be more technical.
Yep.
And I have pursued that with them And if they really say they want to be management, I say, great, let's talk about like, okay, so where can you show, right, that you're a good manager? Because I also don't want you to fail at being a manager, because then that's worse, right? You may end up without a job if it doesn't work out, right? So, I've hopefully been good about putting sort of that leadership, those leadership skills in front of them so that I haven't had an issue. I get people more surprised, especially when I walk into a room and I'm the only one, or I'm the most senior person there.
Yeah.
That I think can be the case. But I think I've been lucky. And, when I moved to Ogilvy, what I really loved was that, they really wanted a woman in the role, right? The CFO was a woman herself. The CEO at Ogilvy is also a woman. So they're really sort of I mean, like, I feel very comfortable in the leadership team at Ogilvy because there are a lot of women in that team. Um, and yes, and even, recruiters, right, in the past have generally sort of they're actively looking for women to be in those roles, and they reach out to me because I think there's very few of us that are actually, CIOs, right?
Yeah.
So probably more today than before. But it's also been interesting hearing recruiters say, this is, I'm looking for a woman in this
Yeah.
role, rather than I'm just looking for the best candidate. And I think that's also valuable. Like, we can't just say, well, I'm unbiased, I'm going to hire the best candidate. Again, it's like telling a woman, go start your own woman in IT organization.
Yeah.
Like, you really actually have to actively promote. I think women are still only 28% of the people in technology. So we're nowhere near that 50-50 parity.
So I think the typical question is, what advice would you give to women coming up? And I think I want to ask the exact opposite question. What advice would you give to guys who kind of see themselves as, they want to be advocates and support women in tech? Like, what are some of the things that they can do other than, well, not other than. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost is to understand what biases you have about women. Um, and not that I know if this would be the case or not, but like, for example, if you think, right, you see a young woman and your immediate thought is she's only going to be with me for a couple of years before she gets married and has children, and now I have a problem. You might not think that's a biased thought, but that's absolutely 100% a biased thought. I think a lot of the conversation recently with the return to office, right? It's at least, I live in the New York City area. There's a lot of conversation about how it's a lot of men that are returning back to office. A lot of women are either resigning, or asking to stay remote because they have a lot more caretaking, responsibilities that men do. It's also thinking about that, right? Like, when you think about your return to office policy and you're asking, women to come in, right? You might actually be letting them go or inadvertently getting them to quit because they're going to look for a company that is offering them a remote position, right? So it's to sort of like think about sort of those biases that you may not even think you have, but that, then limit your ability to keep or retain women in your organization, right? So return to office, right? Women do, and for better for worse, have a lot of the caretaking responsibilities. So what are you doing to make that easier? I remember many years ago before the pandemic, this woman that I used to work with quit to go to another company because she wanted to work from home on Fridays, and her manager didn't let her. I mean, and we lost someone that was really good. And once she left, that's when you really felt like, the loss. And I was like, it was one day a week. She wasn't even saying she wanted to be like remote 5 days a week. It was literally only on Fridays. So she could like be with her children, who I think on Fridays the school system like made them leave early or something like that. So she just wanted to be there to pick up her children. And I was like, for such a little thing, like, it kills me. You lost someone amazing, and then she obviously went to work at a company that let her work from home Mondays and Fridays, pre-pandemic, right? So
Nice.
that was amazing back then. So yeah, so I think it's those biases that we don't really even think are biases, right? Like, it's not that you're not like between a man and a woman, you're not going to hire a woman. Of course you're going to hire, no, not those biases. It's those, like the inclusion, right? That question of like doing happy hours for someone that is a caretaker, much, much harder than someone that's not. So it's sort of trying to understand where you might be slightly biased that you don't realize you're being slightly biased.
Yeah.
I think that would be extremely helpful for men to sort of understand, right? And the assumptions that they make, right? Just because she's young, she's gonna get married and get pregnant. Don't, right? Like just because she's married and she just told you about her wedding, doesn't mean she's gonna have children, right? A lot of women today are talking about not even having children. And even if they do have children, right? It doesn't mean that the output that they're going to produce, even if they have to work from home, is going to be any less, right? Um, and I think it's also understanding, right, where women have more value. Again, if maybe, and I don't know if this is true, but let's say men are more certificate driven, right? And they're getting all the training and all the certificates. Women may not, right? But they might still be as good, right? So it becomes a question of looking, right, at the work that's being produced rather than, looking at the certificates. The other one that I really love, and again, this week came up in a conversation, is I really loved working with one of my HR teams in the past because they had gotten trained on how to write a job description that attracted women.
Hmm.
And at the time, I was like, oh my God, of course. And they showed me, right, like the difference between one versus the other and how you would do this and how you would do that. And I was like, it's not even, right, like whether we can tell, our acquisition talent system to not be biased using AI. It's even just simply the applications that you get, right? Like women will look at a job description and want to meet it 100%. That's just the way
Yeah.
a lot of women think, right? So then how do you write a job description where even if they don't meet all the requirements, that they're still incentivized, right, to apply?
Yeah.
Right. And I found that to be so fascinating because I don't think enough companies, right, think about it that way. They just write the job description. Sometimes it's not even HR that's writing the job description, right? It's the hiring manager that's doing it. They're copy pasting, maybe asking, ChatGPT to write the job description, and then that's what gets published. But there's an art, right, to attracting women. I remember this other woman, and I haven't done this, but she did it because she again was trying to bring more women into her organization. She crawled LinkedIn and she just looked at women, reached out to them, said, "You have an amazing LinkedIn profile. Can we have this conversation?" Right? So the jobs may or may not have been posted. I don't remember the whole story because again, I wasn't in her team. But I admire that she went out of her way, right, to say, I need to bring more women into my team, so I need to manually do it, right? But yes, it was a woman that did this, but men can absolutely do
Yeah.
it, right? Men can absolutely say, my team is not 50-50, so how do I make it 50-50, right? And if women aren't applying, because I've gotten that too, like, women aren't applying to my team, Veronica, I can't, hire women. I'm like, find them, like,
Yeah.
go find them. You can't just, assume women will apply. Again, job description bias, but, so men can take the time, take the moment to say, okay, so where have I seen women? They might be interested. They might not be looking today, but you might make the job interesting enough that they'll say yes.
Yeah, I think that the situation has gotten far more nuanced than simply, you know, would you hire a woman or not? Of
Correct.
course, every guy's going to say, yeah, of course, totally would.
Yeah.
All things being equal, absolutely, like no problem. But they never apply. But
Mhm.
if you don't think through the problem more and think, well, why aren't they applying?
Yes.
And you just even when it comes to literally every example that you gave, if you just think about it a little more, spend more time thinking, with the happy hour, right? And it's not even so much a question just of, is it harder for women to go to that happy hour as is it even, are we, I don't necessarily like the word inclusive, but are we being inclusive because there are so many people who are non-drinkers or, and is that even a healthy way to, to spend your time with anybody? Should you be doing that? Like, is that smart? It's like, let's all go smoke crack. Well, okay. Jimmy's got a crack problem, but that doesn't mean the whole team should, right?
Right.
So what are those activities that we can do that, works for everybody? And so it becomes one of these things where you're really going right back to knowing your audience. You
Mhm.
have to put yourself in your, that their shoes and say, well, what does my team want to do? What works for everybody on the team? And if you're not even taking the time to ask them and you're just commanding from Mount Olympus that this is what we're going to do, we're going to go out to do happy hour because that's what we've always done. It's not the 1950s anymore. The madmen aren't running things anymore, and we have to be more considerate of the whole team and ask, hey, because everybody's different and everybody's running around and they've got different things going on in their lives. So everything's gotten more nuanced. And so I think it's really interesting is you talk about those points, for the men in tech and guys in general, it really is just a matter of thinking about it more instead of being like, well, they didn't show up to they didn't apply.
They didn't apply, yeah, so we can't hire them.
Well,
Yeah, and I think you're right. It is a little bit more nuanced, and maybe because I don't know if other men would do this again. I don't know if anyone actually, men or women, would do this, but I think too, what I've done in my career when I've hired certain people, I've taken a risk, right? I've said, this person is amazing. I don't know why they're applying for a position below what they can do. And I have
mm,
done that for both a man and a woman that come to mind. And in the case of the woman, right, she said to me later, I mean, like a couple years later, that she was so glad that I had taken a chance on her, even though she was overqualified for the role that she was applying, because she was ready to quit technology. Like the function, right? Like she was,
yeah,
I don't know what she was gonna do. I don't know, go to law school, do something else. Like, but she was done working in IT. And by having the opportunity to work for our team, she found the love of technology again, right? And that I adore. She's now doing something wonderful, working for a nonprofit, leading the technology function there. And I'm so glad I was able to I mean, I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I said to her soon to be manager, I'm like, this woman's overqualified. She's probably not going to be with us very long. But if you want to hire her, you can hire her, right? And but so I didn't think she was going to stay that long because of that. But no, she stayed longer than I expected. And then to hear that she just, she was ready to quit IT and that we were able to give her a space to come back to IT because she had had some terrible experiences, was wonderful, right? Because that, again, bad workplaces, are terrible, right? They can make you want to change your job entirely, like your career entirely, go back to school, do something else. So I'm glad that she didn't have to go that far, right? And in another case, I hired this guy who, again, super overqualified, but he wanted an opportunity, and I gave him the opportunity, and he was great for the time he was with us. Again, he then, went somewhere else, but for the time he was with us, he was incredible. And I think that's, sometimes taking a risk in those ways. I really hope that people think about that because it's easy to hire sort of like the perfect person that is just, the qualifications that you put in the job description. But, sometimes if you see sort of like diamond in the rough, run with it, right? Take it
yeah.
and go with it, even if it's, if you're like, it's not going to last, but maybe for the couple years that they're with you, they'll actually like do amazing things in your organization.
Yep. No, I think that is sage advice. I mean,
Mm.
more people should do that, and I think that's great advice. Veronica, I can't
Thank
thank you enough for coming on today. I know we've gone a lot longer than we expected. This was really just a fantastic conversation. But before we go, can you
you.
tell everybody where they can find out more about you and more about Ogilvy?
Yes, absolutely. So Ogilvy, very easy. You can find it at, ogilvy.com. Feel free to check out the work that we've done and our clients and just the story of Ogilvy there. And then you can find me on LinkedIn, of course. LinkedIn, I think, the backslash and then VMILLANC. And I think that's my profile. You can
Awesome.
find me there if you want to
Veronica,
find out
thanks so
more.
much. And until next time.
Thank you. Bye, Matthew.
Thanks for listening to the Cyber Business Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.